Okay, thanks everybody for joining this call, which is hopefully being recorded. My name is Kristen Anton. I'm the online community builder for the New Tactics in Human Rights Project. This Hangout is meant to complement an online discussion that we're hosting on the New Tactics website this week, which is in partnership with Witness, with Kelly Matheson. And the topic is on using video for documentation and evidence. And this Hangout is going to last for 30 to 60 minutes. We have a Q&A feature that's live so people can post their questions. Otherwise, we have a few more spaces for people to actually join the live Hangout if they're out there, and you can ask your questions to this group of practitioners. So this week in the online discussion, we are exploring what video needs in order to be evidence, tips, resources, and tools on how to capture, manage, and verify video in order for it to be used as evidence. We are sharing examples of how video has been used as evidence successfully or potentially unsuccessfully, and we're talking about the challenges that practitioners are facing. So in this Hangout today, we're gonna talk about basically the topics that this group of practitioners would like to discuss. So already we've started talking about archiving, and that's something that we'll touch on just as soon as we can do some quick introductions. So I'm going to ask each person on the Hangout to very briefly introduce themselves, and then I'll hand it over to Kelly to give us a very brief explanation of why we're even talking about why it's important to use video as evidence. So Kelly, why don't we start with you? Can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Kelly Matheson, and I'm a senior attorney and program manager with an organization called Witness, and I oversee our Video as Evidence program. So it's my job to help citizens on the ground enhance the evidentiary value of the video that they're capturing.
Great. Very succinct. Wendy, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Wendy Betts. I'm with the International Bar Association, and I'm directing a project that we've undertaken called Eyewitness to Atrocities. And we're developing a mobile app that can be used to record evidence of human rights abuses in a way that we hope will facilitate its admissibility in court. And then we'll maintain a repository of footage that's submitted to us that we can use and advocate for its use in investigations and trials.
Great. Interesting. Thank you. Abby, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Abby Goldberg. I'm the Deputy Director of the New Media Advocacy Project. New Media Advocacy Project basically integrates video and other kinds of new media to advance challenging human rights cases and campaigns. A lot of the work that we do is actually outside of the courtroom, and it's really interesting to hear more about some of the questions that are being discussed.
Great. Thank you. And Mace, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Mace, and I'm originally from Syria. I'm now living in Turkey. I had to leave Syria for working with the media on reporting the atrocities and the human rights violations that were taking place and the killings that were happening in demonstrations. And now I was trained with Witness early in January 2012, and now I am the MENA consultant with Witness.
Great, thank you. And Frances, can you please introduce yourself?
Hello everybody, my name is Frances. I am a graduate student at Clark University. I am studying for my Master's in International Development and Social Change, and I am interning with New Tactics this summer.
Thank you. And Frances is going to be writing up the summary of the online discussion. And I see we have Enrique, just in time to introduce yourself. Oh, we can't hear you. Enrique, can you hear us? Okay. Well, whenever you are online, go ahead and let me know. Okay, so let me bring this back to Kelly. Kelly, could you please give us just a brief explanation of why we're talking about video to be used as documentation and evidence?
I sure can. Should we let Enrique introduce him? Enrique,
Yeah.
can you hear us?
Hi everyone. I'm Enrique Piraces from Benetech, and I'm late once more.
No problem. I've had a couple technical difficulties, so I think it's partly my fault too. So,
And I'm here to work for gender equality. I can.
yeah,
Good.
Love it.
that's good.
So, what Witness is finding, and I think probably the other groups are finding this too, is that there's a lot of citizens on the ground and activists on the ground that are literally risking their lives to capture human rights violations as they take place. And oftentimes human rights defenders use the video for human rights advocacy, for transitional justice, and as well as media advocacy. But we're finding that a lot of these activists are interested in doing a little bit more. They would love for their video to be used for justice and accountability sometime in the future, really in a court of law. Now, there's one great thing about that. The citizen witnesses and the activists are very well placed because they're on the ground. Someone like in the Syria conflict, for example, people like at the International Criminal Court, they can't get in on the ground. So it'll be years later until they get in on the ground. So the citizen witnesses are the frontline defenders. They are the first responders. So anything that they do is incredibly valuable. But we're also finding that, unfortunately, the video that they're shooting isn't meeting evidentiary standards. It's great for human rights advocacy, it's great for transitional justice, but it can't always be used in a court of law. And because these activists are seeking that, we're working to ensure that activists on the ground at least have access to the information so that if they do want to ensure that their video could be used for criminal justice and accountability someday, they have the information that they would need to learn about that. And so I think this conversation that we've been having online this week is all about how do we help activists on the ground make slight modifications so that it is helpful to lawyers, investigators, and attorneys somewhere down the road. And so that's what we're doing today.
Great, thank you. Just taking.
Does anyone else want to add to that?
Okay, Kelly, that was very good. So, everybody, are there any topics that have come up in the discussion on the website, or any topics that we haven't touched on yet in that forum? Any burning questions or challenges that you'd like to raise here in the next 30 minutes? One topic that's already been raised is archiving, a very specific piece of archiving, and I'll ask Kelly and Abby to pick up on that, but I'm wondering if there's any other topics that you want to be sure to touch on.
The two topics that I'm struggling most is the one, Kristen, that you just identified, and it is the field-based organization and management of the media until it gets to a long-term archive. And then the other one that we're struggling with and researching now is actually interviewing for evidence, because there are reasons, to interview people at the scene of a human rights incident, and there are reasons not to. And so that would be an area that I'd be interested in if people have thoughts on that. And we haven't touched upon that in the online conversation.
I guess one more question that I'd like to ask about is, when is authentication necessary and when isn't it? Or I guess another way to say that is, what are kind of along the spectrum of reaching justice, how do you decide the level of kind of verification that is necessary for a particular legal and advocacy goal?
Okay. Any other topics, questions? We could start with these three, and then maybe something else will come up. Okay. Kelly, which of these should we take the last one first, maybe? The one on authentication?
Yeah, sure. And I think actually Wendy will probably be our resident expert on that and have a lot to say about that. And Wendy, not to put you on the spot,
No,
but I definitely have a number of points to make, but I was thinking, Wendy, I'd let you lead.
Okay.
Because I know it goes to a lot of, when it happens, how much weight, and how it happens.
Yeah. I mean, that's sort of what I was thinking. My short answer would be that authentication is always necessary, but it's more to what level and what weight and what's the standard of proof and how you're using it. Because even if you're doing awareness raising, you want to make sure you're using authentic video all the way up to if you want to be using it in trial for an actual conviction, then you have clearly the higher standard of proof. So I don't know that there's a hard and fast rule for each of those stages, and you outlined very helpfully in your post in the online discussion about how it can be used in different stages, and each of those different stages has sort of a different level of proof. And I think it also goes to, again, the point of how much the video speaks for itself versus how much information in the video is in question, how much could it have been shaped by the bias of the filmer, etc., how much corroborating or lack of corroborating evidence there is. So I think you can take an example, say you had a piece of footage where you had the time and date stamped, you had the GPS coordinates, it filmed everything, but you couldn't quite see something very well, and you have another piece of footage without any of that information, but it's a much better angle. That one's not up to the same level of authentication, but you put the two together and you have a much stronger piece of evidence. So I don't know if that necessarily answers the question of what you need to know about each piece of footage at each point to use it in a different way. I think it's on a spectrum.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I should put this in context, and I maybe frame the question a little bit too openly, because I guess my question is, are there when it's not necessary that evidence is authenticated? If you can show patterns that are happening and it's like clear enough that there's enough submissions, let's say, of information that are showing the same thing, can that be seen as validation, for example, to try and bring the prosecutor, an international prosecutor or prosecutor from the ICC, to then come who would initiate their own investigation? And I guess, so my question is actually pretty specific. I know that once you get to the standards of authentication, it gets a lot more complicated. But I'm curious, that's what I just was saying, that like GPS coordinates may not be as important if you can get a number of submissions that are showing patterns.
Cross corroboration.
And in a situation where international courts would then potentially pursue their own investigation.
I'm trying to think of an example. Kelly, in some of your case studies, do you know of a time where just the multitude of submissions was sufficient versus having one that you could firmly authenticate?
I actually asked my consulting attorney to search for that, and she hasn't found anything yet. We have a lighter example that's not related to court, and that's the work that Priscilla did in Brazil, where they were looking at forced evictions, and they took 114 different videos and they put it into a database to show this pattern of forced evictions so that the government couldn't deny it. Now, so that was the video cross-corroborating it, so each individual piece didn't have to be authenticated, per se, because they were authenticating each other. But that hasn't gone to a court of law yet, and if anyone knows of any case studies where it's happened in a court, that would be fantastic. I'd love to look at it.
One thing to look at was the visit. Just one thing to look at is the visit from the prosecutor, the ICC prosecutor, to Colombia in 2007, and the activities that led up to that.
Could you tell us more about that, Abby?
Well, I'm trying to understand, and I think you guys have much more expertise than I do on this particular issue. But at that time, Twitter didn't even exist. I know Benetech and Martis did because I was working with them at the time elsewhere. But my understanding is that the prosecutor responded to civil society pressure and did visit Colombia. And I guess understanding is that that's a result of the advocacy that was done on the ground. So it's not, I suppose, I'm not sure it's all video, but I wonder, but it's for me potentially an example of being able to show enough of a problem that that you can bring international attention, and not just attention in terms of awareness raising, but actually an investigation.
Yeah.
But that's the only example that I might know of, and I'm certainly not an expert in it, which is why I asked the question.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe if we post it in the online forum, we might get a few more bits of information.
Great.
Okay, should we move on to the archiving question, the field-based management of media?
Sure, the one that I don't know if there's any answers to?
Yeah,
that would be
that one.
Yeah.
Well, so maybe Enrique would have, it sounds like Enrique would have something to contribute on that.
Enrique, do you want me to frame the question for you? Okay. So Witness has worked pretty extensively in putting together the Activist Guide to Archiving, which outlines the key principles of archiving and how to protect your video for the long term, 5, 10, 15 years. What we should do is I'll try and post something about the Reyes Montt trial, in which Pamela Yates was down in Guatemala, and then 20 years later she pulled footage out of a place she called the swamplands of New Jersey, and then that footage was used in the trial against Reyes Montt down in Guatemala. Used beautifully down there. But now things are different because it's not film. It's gone from film to being tapes, to being hard drives, to being these compact discs, to being all sorts of digital media. So the archive, though, we have some good answers to. We know how it works. It's not always, it can be challenging, but at least we have a process. I think the bigger question, which we don't have an answer to, and hoping that one of you guys do, is that when you're an attorney on the ground in a place like Syria, how do you manage your media in the short term after you shoot it before you get it to that long-term encrypted, protected archive that has the resources to manage it for 5, 10, 15 years until those perpetrators are brought to justice? So that's the question. Enrique, do you have an answer?
You have to unmute yourself, I think. Enrique, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Top center, it should be.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. So as a law enthusiast, I have to disclaim I'm not a lawyer, of course. So I'm gonna have to speak from the perspective and I don't work in Syria on the ground, but so I'm gonna just briefly mention a few things that I think may be of relevance. So the idea of collecting video files with an increased level of security on the ground is it's becoming increasingly relevant, given the ability that anyone may have to take a look at all the largely available media. So as far as I understand today, there are certain limitations for the ability of processing high definition large files on the ground for their encryption. But one thing that I think could be interesting to think at this moment is not exclusively thinking about that gap or the challenges at the moment, but potentially be aware that these gaps or challenges will be addressed in the upcoming years. An example of that is the work that organizations like the Guardian Project, in collaboration with Benetech and others, are doing around the encryption of files on mobile devices at the point of capture, which is itself a very challenging bit. My sense is that as we move along technological development, some of these challenges are going to start to be tackled by larger organizations with a bigger technological muscle. So I would say that it is not impossible to think that in a few years from now, we will have devices that are able to encrypt video, seconds or minutes after being recorded. They may be specialized devices. They may be those. I doubt they will be the cell phones that we know as cell phones today. But I don't think it's impossible to think of that. That said, for today, my sense is that there are very few, and again, there's a little bit of ignorance of the full global landscape on this, but my sense is that there are very few professionalized human rights workers that can enter areas of conflict like Syria that will have the ability to do this where there will be tremendous value in the protection of the video. I assume that a legal trip to Syria today may have to be under the umbrella of another organization or potentially even the Syrian government. But I would say that the space where this potentially will see more use today is that space between the more advanced citizen journalists and the professionalized human rights movement, where I think some of this is happening, and I tend to believe that for that bit is not a technological solution that we are, it's more kind of like a methodological set of steps. Was that sufficiently ambiguous?
So, hey, Wendy, I have, I guess, a precise question for you, because I haven't seen anything where because I know you guys are working on a repository, so guidance on how to set up so it's encrypted, it's beautifully kept, but then how do you organize it, tag it, etc., so that it can go into an evidence database instead of just video archive? Do you have some thoughts on that?
Well, that's something we're looking into right now. So I have lots of thoughts, no solutions. So we've been looking at, what are the most salient features of the footage that we need to be able to record and capture and tag. What would investigators and prosecutors most like to know? What are the fields around which would be most useful to aggregate the footage? Do we want to be able to aggregate it by time, date, location, named individuals in the footage, type of conduct in the footage, crime-based versus linkage, all of these. So at the moment, we've just been looking at some type of very flexible, even almost just a regular field database that we can choose our search parameters until we have a better sense both of what type of information is going to really be coming in versus what we anticipate we'll receive with the footage, and what's going to be most useful for investigators and prosecutors. I've heard from some investigators that they would love to get information organized all the way down to time, date, location, perpetrator, and type of conduct, all organized in that manner. And then looking to how you can integrate that into the types of case management software that different courts are using, being a challenge since different jurisdictions are obviously using different types of software, and especially the ICC is still sort of figuring out how they themselves want to catalog this type of information to know how on our end we should be preparing it for them. So some of the case management software I've looked at doesn't quite fit the bill, I think, for the human rights organization's purposes, because it's so focused on preparing it for discovery and turning it over and pulling together other investigative pieces. So we're still going back and forth with the idea of taking something off the shelf or building something from scratch. And then there's the added piece of how do you incorporate the tools that are out there for mass-level data analysis, like the Rashomon project in Berkeley, and some of those other platforms. So how can whatever we use be compatible with those also, so you can, input your data into that and identify patterns and other sources of information that you hadn't recognized. So we're still very much looking at all those different options, and we have not settled on what that back-end framework, how to optimize that,
is going to look like. Mace, do you have any thoughts from the ground? Oh, sorry, Enrique.
So one thing that I want to mention here is that, I mean, for those of us that are working in the frame of the human rights movement, I think that we tend to think that we are in a field where nothing exists. Like, for example, those of us that work in the encryption world tend to kind of like invent things because they don't exist. But one of the things that I have learned over the last years is that we just probably need to expand kind of like the places where we're looking at for previous experiences of best practices or tools. An example of that is law enforcement in the U.S. Law enforcement is, I would argue, one of the richest industries when it's about video and media management for evidence gathering. There are projects out there that are available under a significant fee, but like evidence.com, which is an easy find. Just go to evidence.com and you'll see that something that is a mix of some of the tools that many of us produce are out there. So my sense is that for things that are about just the management of information, evidence management, digital evidence management, there's a lot of it that can be learned from existing sectors. It doesn't seem to be kind of like where most of the complicated things. I would argue that the things that are most important today and where we could make a difference are around kind of like the protection of the data from vulnerable populations. In that sense, it is quite possible that one could say that the information that has been made available on YouTube, it's already too public, so it doesn't need to be preserved in a secure way. But the point that I want to make is around, what happens with that data once that we embed it in a content or evidence management system where other people, like domain experts or human rights defender, add metadata to it, increase its value by making sure that it's authenticated as part of a location, by making sure that the people involved in this video are, authenticated or potentially cross-referenced. So to that point, I think that where we could make a difference is making sure that the systems that we use or create for that bit, where more sensitive information is created, are aware of the potential implications of, the management of such information. I don't think it's just about making the process more efficient. I think that for that bit, we can learn a lot from the commercial sector, including the law enforcement.
I think, Mace, when you're typing, you have to mute your keyboard.
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry.
No worries.
Okay. Well, from our experience, like in Syria, it's like what we're also concerned about, not only the technological challenges, but also the logistical challenges. If you're following with the Syrian case, it's like there's a huge amount of video that is coming through every day from different geographic areas in Syria. So I think the first challenge is for activists and video activists and the people who are coordinating with the investigators, whether they are local people who are documenting or the people who are working with international bodies that are doing, like Human Rights Watch or even the International Inquiry Commission, they have to know what is the useful and what is not the useful to keep and to document, to archive. Most of these activists have been working with the media, and sometimes we've learned that things that are useless to the mainstream media and they do not care about are things that are important to document if you want your video to be used as an evidence, like documenting the place that the incident happened at. Another case is like with the Amnesty case study, where they used different videos that they looked in a way that could be useless, but when they were integrated together, they were able to identify that the bomb attack happened in that place, in that area, in that time. So when you have such a huge amount of videos coming on daily basis, and when you have a territory like Syria, it's geographically torn apart, so people cannot commute very easily, and they cannot meet and work together. How can we facilitate this? How can we make a process where they can do this together. I'm not sure if I made myself clear enough.
No, I want to ask Abby if you've got any thoughts, but I think that that's the thing that I'm struggling with most is not the capture end because there's encryption and not the long-term management of it because I think there are precisely, I completely agree with Enrique, there's technology out there. It's just how do you deal with that middle moment when you've captured it and you have to get it to somewhere safe? Abby, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that I have been having a similar challenge with work in Mexico, where there's been existing many existing documentation efforts, none of which have really been coordinated. So we have tons of information, but no way to understand it in the aggregate, because there are no data points that we can look at to see patterns. And so one of the things, actually, Enrique is doing some work with New Media Advocacy Project on this, is trying to understand how we are already doing documentation and very invested in whatever system they've developed, then aggregate information so that it can actually be useful for litigation and other legal advocacy. And I don't have the answer to that question, but I hope to have better answers to it in the coming months.
Matisse also joined the Hangout. I don't know, Matisse, we've been talking about archiving or having a safe place in between the capture and the very secure archival system, how to get the digital media from one place to another. I don't know if you had anything to add on that topic or if you had any other questions or topics that you wanted to discuss.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
No, I don't have anything to add to that. I think as I am the communications manager at Witness, one of the things that I think it's great. Thank you to New Tactics and to everybody on the call, for discussing this. I think it's we're discovering that it's pretty crucial to try and educate both practitioners in the legal and international policy arenas about why this is a crucial topic, as well as activists. But I think also there are members of the media and the general public who benefit from knowing more about the complexity of this issue, and that it's something that I think increasingly will be quite important to seeing justice served beyond just raising awareness about issues. So I'm just actually here to learn more rather than to probably contribute anything great or useful to the conversation, but thanks for including me.
Okay, thanks, Matisse. Glad you're here.
Kristen, Enrique asked a question. Can I
yes,
address
please.
that? So Enrique asked why we need that middle step. And, if we don't, we don't, which would be great. What we're hearing from activists on the grounds and citizens that we need that middle step because they have all this footage that they're gathering, whether it's on their cell phones or their little cameras, etc. And it's a significant amount of data. So you could just do a data dump, right? You could just take it off the cell phones and dump it, dump it with the investigators. But we do this exercise which is really fun, maybe I should post it, where we look at videos of rubble. And there's rubble from the Iraq earthquake. There's rubble from a Syrian military strike. There's rubble from a Russian gas explosion. And I don't tell people what it is. I'm like, just write down what country and what happened. And people don't get it right. They don't know what it is. So if you do this dump off of cell phones, this dump off of hard drives without organizing it in some sort of way in the field, then you give it to these investigators and they don't know if it's in Raqqa or Dara or Aleppo or Mexico City or Colombia. They can't tell. So I see the middle step as helping the folks on the ground primarily organize it in a way that the investigators can understand it and they don't have to go back and find that person that they might not ever find again to ask the questions like, what is this? And even if that media doesn't serve as evidence in court, that media serves, quite often as lead evidence to help them figure out the full story and figure out where to go next. So that's the middle step I'm talking about.
No, and that makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Kelly. So one thing that we have been discussing in the context of the development of the next generation of martyrs, and this is one of the reasons I have engaged with half of you, is that we think that not just martyrs, but there's a few different types of technologies that are very close to be that solution if they account for these use cases. And again, I have to say, it's not just martyrs out there. There's a few other tools that could serve this purpose. So one thing that I have seen is then we're assuming that in this middle step, and again, I don't want to be demeaning in using the middle step term, just like this thing that is undefined, will involve kind of like moving the data from the collection device anyway, right? And if that is the case, there's a few very interesting developments today on the technological field that may help us simplify this effort. I'm going to use the example of the Anonimo Incognito Live system, also known as Tails, which is a secure Linux in a stick. And the very interesting thing about it is that anyone can, load a working operative system out of that. One of the things that we have been experimenting is to, use such a thing to have a set of, to have a Martus implementation that people can use for a specific purpose. And again, understanding that there's other tools, not just Martus, it is not crazy for us to think that today we could be providing USB sticks that have, that solution. It may be that in some cases it's not a technological solution and it's just the steps, right? Like there's some text there that guides you through different channels. But if that middle step could assume that there's the dump of information from the collection device, I think that we could be very close. And I will be very happy to kind of like work with anyone on this to try to find a workable prototype.
You're in, Enrique. We're recruiting you.
Okay, I know Kelly has to leave in a little bit here. Do we want to move on to the interview question? I don't know if anybody would have anything to share, maybe Wendy or Abby or...
It's an important question for me, but I guess I would also like to know if it's an important question for the group. Mm-hmm. But I can lay out while I'm struggling with it if it is an important question for you guys.
Well, I think from our end it's important. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Abby, go ahead.
No, I just was asking if someone could repeat the question.
Mm-hmm. I'll go ahead. So obviously, when you're in the field, you do a lot of interviewing for advocacy because personal stories are vitally important when it comes to media stories, when it comes to working with policymakers, etc. But there is conflict over whether or not you should actually interview on camera for evidentiary purposes, or whether you should do those interviews as much as you can on paper. And a lot of that has to do with if it's on camera, someday down the road, if people remember things differently, I'm oversimplifying here, but if people remember things differently, you've got an exact record of what that person said 5 years ago, and so it's much easier to discredit someone, 5 years later if they're memory. Whereas if it's written down in a third-person interview, the discrediting process is much more challenging. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's a topic that I'll be asking the same team. Like I'll ask someone at the ICC, should you use a camera to interview? Someone will say no, and then I'll ask someone else, should you use a camera to do interviews? And the next person will say yes. There's a number of organizations. I've asked people within the same organization, and they disagree on this answer. I don't know what you've heard, Wendy.
No, I was going to say that's the same experience that I've had, and this is a key question for us as well, because to the extent that we sort of disseminate this app and are trying to provide best practices on how to use it, do we dissuade people from recording witness interviews, or do we encourage it? And I've had the same experience. Some people will say adamantly, don't do it. It interferes with the investigators. Only the investigators know the right questions to ask anyway. and you risk providing fodder for undermining their testimony later. And so we've been struggling with this same issue and haven't really found a good source either that's definitive.
Yeah. So I'll just put out, I guess, the broad picture of what we've been thinking. The activists on the ground and the citizens, they're going to interview with cameras. You're not going to get everyone not to do it. So I think that's the assumption, is even if we were all agreed they shouldn't do it, they're still going to do it. So yeah. So then the question is, then how do you provide guidance on that, which is one thing we're working on. But then the other thing we always start when we talk to activists on the ground is reasons why you would use a camera and reasons why you wouldn't. And I can post those on the New Tactics conversation. But so, for example, one reason is timing. Because when the UN went in to go back to the Huta example, they had 7.5 hours on the ground. And so they couldn't do written interviews as quickly as they needed to do written interviews. So they actually used a video camera to do the interviews. Sometimes you're not going to ever be able to find those people again. So you aren't going to bring them to court. So you don't have to worry about the fodder for discrediting them. So go ahead and use a camera. But then there's other reasons, of course, not to. One being it may undermine their credibility later, or there's security issues, or there's ethical issues, etc. So whenever we talk with activists, we go through why you would use a camera and why you would not, so that at least they're hopefully making an educated and an informed decision. But I think it is a complicated question.
I guess I'll chime in with a little bit of 2 cents on this. First of all, I think it'd be very helpful to see more about sort of the 2 sets of arguments and sides of arguments. It's a question I haven't really thought about that much before. We do a lot of interviews, most of which are not used in a court setting per se, but used to advocate for things sort of around courts. So for working on a case now where we're making the case for admissibility and using video with victims who are bringing the case, but it's not actually being used as evidence, it's being used as a way to push for admissibility in the inter-American system. My answer to that question, without, this is not authoritative, I don't know the answer, but I would say, to your point, that everybody is using video, that you do, to some extent, have to meet people. When using technology, I think you do have to meet people where they are with the communications tools that they use. So to me, it would be more a question of how do you manage that information in a way that would work? How do you communicate with courts to address that? The interview is going to be this, I don't see why not to use video, basically. Though there are risks, I guess, there are risks that it would be used against, if somebody else were to get that information. A case happened in, I think it was the Chevron in Latin America, where documentary filmmakers had to turn over all of the material that they had collected, and it ended up being used against them. But that could happen on paper too. And there are other ways that paper could be destroyed. So I think it's more a question of information management to me, and then also just realistically, what tools do people use today? Because you're most likely to get, especially if it's citizen reports with the tools that are being used by those people to begin with.
Wendy, do you have, sorry, go ahead, Kristen.
I was actually going to wrap it up, so if you have anything else to add, Kelly, go for it.
No, I think it's an open question, and I look forward to exploring it more. I know we have some opportunities coming up as a community to explore it more this fall, etc. So we'll just report back with any further information we get, because it's too complex to flesh out here.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, everybody, for joining this hangout. Is there any other last questions, burning questions that you really want to bring up now while you have the chance?
Nope.
Okay. All right. Then if this is being recorded, and I hope somehow miraculously it is, I will post it to the online discussion on the New Tactics website. If not, I'll try to summarize what we talked about. But I also encourage you to go ahead and post the questions that have been raised and, you know, continue the discussion on the forum so that this can be shared with many more people than just this little group. So thank you all for joining, and this has been so interesting. I hope it was useful for you guys. And I'll see you all in the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for organizing us.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.